I'm Tom Landon. Today we'll learn what it takes to teach and learn in rural communities. The Center for Rural Education at Virginia Tech may be the coolest organization in our region that most of us have never heard of. The center partners with rural communities in and around Southwest Virginia to ensure equitable K-12 educational experiences for all in an effort to put our kids on equal footing as those kids in wealthy divisions in other parts of the state. Dr. Amy Price Azano is the founding director of the organization and is a professor of rural education and adolescent literacy in the Virginia Tech School of Education. More importantly, she's a product of rural schools herself and grew up in Luray in the Shenandoah Valley. Deirdre Hand is a community engagement specialist with the Center for Rural Education and the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies and grew up just down I-81 in Radford. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
I'm so glad you're here. And Amy, you and I have gotten to know each other a little bit over the last year or so, and but there's a lot of stuff I don't know. So what I want to start with is I'm just always curious, how did you get interested in what you're doing and what in your background kind of led you to where you are?
Gosh. Well, thank you. Thank you for having us. I love talking about where I'm from. I am from Luray, Virginia. Hooray for Luray. It's a beautiful spot in the Shenandoah Valley. And when I was growing up, my grandmother, my nanny, my maternal grandmother, is one of 12 kids. And so my mom and dad both have lots of siblings. And so everywhere I went, there were aunts and uncles and cousins, and it was just this really warm youth experience that I had, a real sense of belonging. So it wasn't until I left that community where I started realizing that other people didn't quite see rural spaces and rural people in the same way that I had that firsthand experience. And so my parents were first-generation high school graduates, and they really encouraged my sister and I to become first-generation college students. And so when I went away, that's when I found out I had an accent. That's when I found out that when people heard about where I was from, lots of assumptions were made about who I was, what I believed, who raised me, who I would vote for, and so on and so forth. And so that became a little bit of a tension for me as I, went through my own schooling experiences. And then when I became a teacher, I taught in suburban and urban school districts. And then again, I felt that tension because I saw these opportunities that my students had with dual enrollment courses, advanced placement courses, and lots of other, curricular and extracurricular opportunities that in the rural community where I grew up, they just didn't exist. And so that took me to grad school and took me to Virginia Tech. And fortunately, we were able to found the Center for Rural Education where we're trying to, like you said, create more equitable footing for our students.
Yeah. And Deirdre, I know, first of all, you've just flown in from Rwanda, so
yes.
Thank you for
apologies in advance.
And I just want to know a little bit about what led you to where you are.
So I am from Radford. My mom is from Indiana, and my dad is from Ireland, but my stepdad is from Floyd County, and I grew up between Radford and Floyd County. And so similarly to Amy, have that kind of experience of rural, but a little bit kind of newer rural, I guess, maybe. And I did not always know I was going to be a teacher. Education was not the plan, but I ended up falling in love with teaching English as a foreign language to actually here in Roanoke through a Virginia Tech program as an undergrad, working with refugees here in the area. And so I became an ESL teacher and taught abroad off and on for the past, 15 years, and came back to Tech and did my master's in ESL, and also taught in urban schools in DC. And when I came back to home, Southwest Virginia, I realized that it kind of just worked out that I was already connected to the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies, and this position was a marriage of two centers, basically. And when I found out that the other center that was going to be hiring me was rural education, I thought, what is this? This is amazing.
And I want to talk about that a little bit because I think, again, I alluded to it in the opening. I know you're not a complete mystery, but I think a lot of people didn't know that Virginia Tech has a Center for Rural Education Studies. And so talk about that a little bit. What was the reason that we needed it?
Yeah, so, I started off in the School of Education. I'm a professor of rural education and adolescent literacy. But like many of my colleagues in rural education, we sort of come to this work through a back door there aren't a lot of programs out there for rural education. There are lots of urban studies, urban education programs, but not so many in rural ed. And so I was a literacy professor and did that work. But as I more and more thought about the context and not just the content, that helped me connect with other people at Virginia Tech who were also doing work in rural communities, not necessarily schools, for example, but they were also very committed to equity challenges in rural spaces. And so at the, this is my 13th year at Virginia Tech, and I've had lots of different research studies, lots of different, funding organizations and that sort of thing. But regardless of the challenge that I was looking at, it sort of always brought me to the same answer. And that was that the equities or the inequities that I was looking at in a rural school could not necessarily be solved by the people in that school, that these were structural and systemic issues that we were looking at. So for example, when a rural hospital closes, that doesn't just impact doctors and nurses and people at home. That has a huge and profound impact on the schooling experience for young people and also recruiting teachers, right, if it doesn't have access to medical care. So I give that example because when we started the Center for Rural Education, I was able to connect with people who had a different skill set that they were bringing to those challenges that I wasn't able to offer. And so now we have a real synergy that's happening at Tech around these issues of rural schooling and rural communities at large.
The assumptions that people make sometimes about rural learners, rural schools, rural people. Deirdre, as a community engagement person, where do you see that, and what are some of the things we have to kind of go against when we come into a space?
Yeah, I think from my perspective and my background in ESL, I think one area that I see that's really strongly is in this idea of rural America being very white and being a very monolithic kind of same group of people, when in fact it's always been a very diverse, at least in this region, thinking about Appalachia, but of course more broadly, rural spaces in general are more diverse than I think they are portrayed. And so like one example of that is how we push back is one program that we started last year was in partnership with Galax High School. And I got in touch because it's kind of the melding of the two spaces I'm really interested in rural education and in refugee and migrant studies, with the head of ESL there, Elizabeth Stringer-Nunley. And we talked and we were like, I said, what is it that you need? Like, what would be helpful for you? They have one of the highest populations in the state of English learners.
And I think that fact alone is
like
that's shocking to a lot
totally, yeah. Galax, right? Like, and I think if you live real close to there, you might know that. But otherwise, yeah.
Right. There are a lot of Hispanic stores and a lot of the people who work on the Christmas tree farms.
Exactly. And there were factories there and things that have shut down since, but they're like second, third generation, Latino students there in Galax. And Elizabeth said, what we need is a mentorship program. We have students who are dropping out of high school at a rate, the Latino students are dropping out at a rate that is much higher than the, state students who are born here, for example, or even actually Latina students who were born in the U.S., but are still dropping out at higher rates. So what we did was we launched a mentorship program called the Galax Mentorship Program, and we recruited 16 mentors, Virginia Tech students who are from Latina backgrounds, and they incredibly just launched this thing and partnered with the students in Galax. They would meet weekly on Zoom, and monthly the students would either come to Virginia Tech or we would go to the high school, and created these amazing relationships. And in fact, the Virginia Tech students decided to turn it into a student organization. So it's now called Primeros Pasos. And our center and the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies are co-sponsors of this group, but they've made it into their own. Elizabeth was like, she cried like every time we got with them, because she was like, and the students, they lit up when they came to Virginia Tech the first time. Remember, they were like,
we had a hype squad.
Yes.
About that, like we all know in all of the education programs we talk about here and in other places, like mentorship. I've had jobs for Virginia graduates here, and they're talking about the importance of having a mentor, and so that's true.
Yeah,
it's not just true for for one group of kids, right?
Yeah, and being able to see yourself,
that's
right?
Yeah, I was just going to say, when the Galax kids exited the bus the first time they came onto our campus, one of the kids said, oh my gosh, they look like us, when they saw the mentors waiting for them. Yeah. And so, so not only does that fit the mission, both of the Center for Rural Education and our neighboring center, our Friends Center, for refugee, migrant, and displacement studies. But there was something really happening, not just for those mentees, but also for the mentors at Virginia Tech. And so that's a program we're really proud of. And then also to see the energy that the students picked up and that they're carrying it forward, sort of a case in point what we're trying to do.
You use the phrase on your website and in other things I've been reading, educational equity is used a lot. What does that even mean? Because I think there's a lot of confusion in the general population when we use words like equity.
Yeah.
What's it mean to you? What's it mean to the center?
Right. Well, I often, think about the concept of Virginia as a commonwealth, right? We call ourselves a commonwealth. And I ask the question, like, what is common about our wealth in Virginia? Right, like when we look at Virginia, and we have these big urban centers, and they've heard me joke before that we have Nova. Everyone knows Northern Virginia, and I say we're from Rova, which is the rest of Virginia or rural Virginia. And I think that sometimes we don't always think about the place specificity when we're talking about educational policy and how things will have a ripple effect into places like Far Southwest, and so. When we don't pay attention to those things, then we're entering our students into a zip code lottery. And based on where they happen to go to school, they're going to have very different experiences. That's an equity issue. So, we have places where, again, if you're coming from a more affluent or richly resourced suburban school district, and it's not to say that there aren't also challenges inherent in those places. I absolutely recognize that. But you're also talking about students who are looking at a menu of options of advanced placement and dual enrollment. They have colleges that are coming there to recruit students. They have very formal, career and technical education programs, and so on and so forth. And then if you're in a rural school that is struggling financially, they might be struggling to find a Spanish teacher, right? They might be struggling. I've talked to teachers who say, well, I tried to retire twice, but they couldn't find a second grade teacher, so here I am again. And we hear those stories. And then also if we kind of zoom out from that and look at, this more like from a systemic equity lens, we can ask questions about, our rural students are graduating at the same graduation rate as our non-rural students and sometimes even higher, and yet those students are not going to college. And so, where are the barriers? Where are the missed opportunities? And that's something that we're paying attention to at the Center for Rural Education.
And it's, I used to tell my students who were juniors and seniors in high school, who were from far Southwest Virginia, I would make sure as they were writing their essays and things, I would say things like, make sure you refer to yourself as an Appalachian American.
Yes.
Because those people at Duke or UVA or whatever, you actually you can be a little exotic and special.
Right.
You are exotic and special.
Yes,
you
that's
just
right.
have to recognize that.
Right. Well, there's these funds of knowledge that we bring to the table. And, I think that too often we don't recognize that in a schooling environment, but kids are bringing that to the table and absolutely, play that up. That's a superpower, and they can, put that into a college essay, and it might not be college, right? But they, those equity challenges don't always have to be sort of the end game at college, but they should have their needs met and the same opportunities that you would find anywhere in any school district, whether it's in the Commonwealth or somewhere else.
This is a big issue,
yeah.
Right? I know you can't do it alone, and I know that partnerships are very important to you. So I'd like both of you kind of to talk about other organizations or other groups that you are partnering with to try to leverage the power of what you're trying to do.
Well, I guess I've already spoken a bit to the Center for Refugee, Migrant, and Displacement Studies as a partner. That's just within Virginia Tech. But I think you're absolutely right. There, rural education is not just its own little thing that is secluded from all the other, like Amy was saying, like health, just community wellness in general. And so I think one thing that we do, I think very well is trying to connect with all the different folks at Virginia Tech, but even beyond that, outside of that in the community. And I think you can speak best to all of the many partners that the center has.
Yeah, well, we see it. We have a summer program, a summer enrichment experience at Virginia Tech that we call CVT. And that's sort of like a great place where you can really see those partnerships come to life. We have, instructors that are from College of Science, ag, all over Virginia Tech. We have instructors who come and sort of their passion project, and they're able to work with young people. And then we, sort of go out into the community. We partner with the Moss Arts Center, with the Lyric in downtown Blacksburg. And so, people who, once they hear, like you said, we're still a little bit of a secret, because we are a news center, but the more that people hear about us, they go, gosh, that really is important. We do need to lift up those experiences because they do look different, and we can kind of highlight those, and our summer program is one of the ways that we do that.
Well, and when you talk about the health care, that really resonates with me as well, because I know many, like the medical school here through Virginia Tech, is really making an effort to get into rural communities, to get their graduates to practice in rural communities. It feels like does it feel sometimes like every problem that society has is kind of multiplied in rural environments without maybe the press that urban environments get?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's very complex, and I think that you're pointing at that. And I'll give you for example, we often don't pay our teachers in rural schools the same pay that they would find in a non-rural area. And one of the rationale for that is, what do we say? We say that, well, it's more affordable to live in a rural place. And what you just described are some of those just it's harder to put our finger on of why it may not be more affordable to live in a rural space when you have to drive to Roanoke to access medical care, right? So those are some of the things that, or if there's not a child care facility in that place, or if there's, public transportation in a rural community, or apartment buildings, things that are a little bit harder to, I guess, like monetize, then it makes the challenge a little bit harder to describe, but they're absolutely nuanced and different than what you might find in a suburban or urban area.
And yet, in many ways, I mean, you talk to this, both of you maybe, it seems to me that in many ways, like, rural schools are probably more important to their communities than they are in the suburbs and the cities. And am I right about that? And
yes, Yeah, a lot of people point to that because, it's a community center, right? It can be the hub of the community. It's your Friday night entertainment. That's the school play. And, it's could be the hottest thing in town is like what's happening at the school. And so that's why issues around like school consolidation, or when we have population decline in rural areas, that hits a little different in a rural place when people are worried that their schools might close. And again, points to some of those equity challenges that we mentioned, but absolutely, it can be the heartbeat of a community, and that's no small thing, in rural places. And so, and again, I think that creates a little bit of a tension too, though, right? Like, because we know that there are equity challenges, and we know that rural places can be, that they're resilient and that they have all of these assets, and yet we're not funding them in the same way. We're not really thinking about rural places or even seeing those challenges in the same way. So I'm hopeful that the Center for Rural Education can bring some attention to that, and then highlight the ways that we can lift up those rural places.
And you mentioned coming to the center and finding your happy place, kind of
my people.
Yeah, right. It's so important to find your people, right? But what surprised you most, that since you started about the work?
Yeah, it's that's a great question. What has surprised me most? I think, as I said, I grew up in Radford, so we considered ourselves to be in the big city, of course.
Right.
So I was not rural. But now that I left and I've lived abroad, I'm like, oh yeah, I live in a pretty rural area. And I think a lot, this maybe didn't surprise me, but I think something I've learned a lot over the years is like how this idea of like asset-based versus like, or what am I trying to say? Assets, like trying to see like the asset and the beautiful things about living in a rural area. And I think maybe what has surprised me is my own reaction to just being so happy to be home, maybe like that this is home and it's such a special place. And I've always thought that, but I guess thinking about rural schools, my background is ESL, so I've taught in a lot of urban places and abroad. But coming back to the area and looking at like how are ESL students doing in rural areas, I think I don't know. I guess what has surprised me is more just like my own, I guess, curiosity for like wanting to kind of dig in more and learning so much from Amy and my other colleagues at the center of, I got in through the refugee migrant kind of center, but I'm like, wow, this is like, if I was to choose another center, wow, how cool that it was this. And right. I don't know, I think it just has really opened my mind to how much I still need to or want to learn. Maybe.
Sure. And one thing that strikes me again is, as somebody who taught online to a lot of rural students for years, is that the brightest among those kids are often encouraged.
Oh.
Then
Yeah.
get out of here,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah.
This is and that's fair, right? They should have the same opportunity to leave
Sure.
as anybody else. But I mean, do you think that message has changed at all, or how do we encourage our brightest to at least consider sticking around?
Absolutely. I mean, this is, we spent a lot of time thinking about this at the center. And that was definitely the message that I got as a young person growing up in a rural community. My parents, they pushed us to go, like, you have to go do and be, you have to go somewhere else and do it. And we have the sort of press of neoliberal education, that we're schooling young people for the greater good, and that greater good happens in, cities and suburbs. And so how do we, address equity challenges, encourage rural students to have more opportunities, and yet not drive them out of the homes that they love, right? Not drive them away we don't want to be part of the problem. We want to be part of the solution. And so we spend a lot of time thinking about this with our programs, how we can center place and place-conscious education at the core of everything that we're doing. So I think where we see this the most is in our summer camp. Even our T-shirts, it says, if you can see it, you can be it. And so what we want to do is we want to bring young people, we want to bring rural students from these rural middle schools to Virginia Tech and show them that what they're bringing from home, there's a discipline behind that, right? Like it has value and it has worth.
Yeah, right. There's a lot of things rural kids know that it's never had a
Absolutely.
chance to
Exactly.
learn.
And then also that you can get a degree in that and go back home.
Yeah.
That it serves that it serves the community that you already care about. Now, if they go and graduate, if they were to come to Virginia Tech or any other college and they end up living in Manhattan, then they would be the person at the table advocating for that rural community. So either way, it's a win, right? And then, and we can do that at a summer camp, but we can also do that every single day in a rural school and in every rural classroom, is just reinforce this idea that place matters, that we can think about our sort of global competencies and things that we learn about the world through a place lens. And also being a part of a small local community, you are part of the global economy. You are part of a global community. And I think sometimes that message just gets missed, or it doesn't get amplified enough for rural kids. So we spend a lot of time thinking about it and planning programs to make sure that we're centering place in our activities. Two things that are happening right now. The first is the Blue Ridge Montanitas Festival. And that is funded by the Mellon Foundation through the Monuments Across Appalachian Virginia. And that is an effort that we have to bring Latino and Appalachian communities together, which you've heard us already talking a little bit about. It's certainly a commitment that we have at the center. And we're bringing people to our hometown of Luray, Virginia. And I'm partnering with a childhood friend of mine, Estella Diaz-Knott. And she's a musician and an artist, and her project, or her band called the Lua Project, has partnered with us to really celebrate this shared heritage and this shared culture and community. And then we're also doing the Rural Education Summit, which I think also is what you were alluding to. The Rural Education Summit is one of our most important community-facing events that we do each year. The first year we were celebrating and thinking about diversity in rural spaces. Last year we looked at community health and wellness. And this year we're really focusing on what does it mean to support our queer, our LGBTQ plus students and educators who are living and learning and thriving in rural spaces. And so we are, that is the focus of this year's Rural Education Summit. And it's radically important to bring people together and to give a safe space for us to talk about tough topics. And so that's what we're doing at the summit this year.
Talk about kids wanting to leave, or maybe being encouraged by their families to leave. That's an especially tough place to be when you are a child who is LGBTQ and living in a place. But also, I'm sure you want us to understand that these folks have been with us. They live with us. They've always been there, and they always will be, right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, there are thriving queer communities in rural spaces everywhere. We've always been there, and we always will be, and we don't want to have to leave the places that we love. And what I think will be important at this year's summit is there's so much politicking and rhetoric around these issues. But if everybody could kind of set that down and just look at kids and young people and think about what's important to keep a young person healthy, alive, safe, and thriving in these rural spaces, because our politics and our rhetoric doesn't have to interfere with that focus. And so regardless of what we believe, regardless of how you vote, regardless of those things, as we said in the beginning, we still have these kids in our community, and we want to make sure that they are able to thrive and learn and grow up just as you would anywhere else, and that the end game is not having to leave that space. And so, so we're really excited to bring people to the table to, like I said, have a safe space for having really tough conversations in our political environment.
We are down just the last little bit of our time here, and where can people learn more about what you all are doing?
Yes, we have a great website. It's called rural.vt.edu, or you can just Google the Center for Rural Education at Virginia Tech. And you can find lots of resources that we have there. And there's an easy email, rural@vt.edu, that folks can reach out to us. Easy way to get in touch with either one of us.
And we're on Instagram.
That's right. We're on Instagram.
I don't run it, luckily, because
But it does exist.
But it exists. We have some great grad students working on it.
Well, thank you for making the trip, and I hope you get some rest tonight.
sorry.
We are out of time, but again, if you want to keep up with the Center for Rural Education, that's rural.vt.edu. For What It Takes, I'm Tom Landon.